At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, on March 7, 2019, Venezuela went dark. Not gradually, not city by city, but all at once. Traffic lights blinked, then died. Subway trains froze inside tunnels. Elevators stopped between floors. In hospitals, machines fell silent, and nurses reached for flashlights. Across Caracazo and far beyond it, a nation accustomed to noise, movement, and heat was suddenly wrapped in stillness. The blackout did not arrive with an earthquake or a storm. There was no wind, no rain, no warning. Only silence, heavy, unnatural, spreading from the Guri Dam outward, like a shadow rolling across the land. In the darkness, people gathered on balconies and sidewalks, listening. Some whispered prayers. Others waited for the hum of generators that never came. Refrigerators warmed. Phones searched for signals that did not exist. Time itself seemed to slow, as if the country were holding its breath. By nightfall, Venezuela, home to the largest proven oil reserves on Earth, resembled something far older than a modern petrostate. Candles replaced streetlights. Buckets replaced running water. Neighbors shared what little they had, because sharing was the only thing that still worked. Outside the country, explanations came quickly. Inside it, answers did not. The blackout felt less like a technical failure and more like a message, delivered without words, but impossible to ignore. A reminder that power, once taken for granted, can vanish in an instant. And so, in the quiet that followed, a question lingered in the dark, slow and unsettling. How did the richest oil nation on Earth end up here? To understand that night, we must leave the darkness behind and travel back nearly a century to where this story truly begins. Chapter 1: The Curse of Black Gold. This story begins, as so many modern histories do, with oil. In the early decades of the 20th century, Venezuela was a quiet, largely agrarian nation at the northern edge of South America. Its people farmed the land, fished the coasts, and lived far from the centers of global power. Then, beneath the soil of Lake Maracaibo and the eastern plains, something ancient stirred. Black, viscous, and immensely valuable crude oil began to rise to the surface. By the 1920s, the discovery had transformed the country almost overnight. Derricks pierced the horizon. Foreign engineers arrived by ship. Pipelines replaced footpaths. And by 1929, Venezuela had become the second largest oil producer on Earth, surpassed only by the United States itself. Yet the wealth flowing from the ground did not flow into Venezuelan hands. 3 foreign corporations, Royal Dutch Shell, Standard Oil of New Jersey, and Gulf Oil, controlled roughly 98% of the country's oil production. Contracts written far from Caracas ensured that profits traveled outward, across oceans, into boardrooms in London and New York. What remained behind were wages, not ownership. Infrastructure built for extraction, not for national development. It was a strange paradox. A nation sitting atop unimaginable wealth, yet unable to touch it. Oil reshaped Venezuela's place in the world, but it also froze its political future. Governments rose and fell under the shadow of foreign interests. Decisions about production, pricing, and distribution were made in languages not spoken by the people whose land was being drained. The state became dependent on rents it did not control, and the economy bent itself entirely around a single resource. This was not prosperity. It was dependency, dressed as abundance. During these years, Venezuela learned a quiet lesson, one that would echo through generations. Resource wealth, when owned by others, does not liberate a nation. It binds it. It distorts institutions, attracts outside pressure, and teaches elites to govern for access rather than for sovereignty. Oil brought roads and ports, but it also brought silence where debate should have been. It brought dollars, but it postponed democracy. It created the illusion of modernity while hollowing out the foundations beneath it. Long before sanctions, long before coups and blackouts, the curse had already taken hold. Venezuela possessed gold beneath its soil, but it was black gold, and it came with a price. A price paid not all at once, but slowly, year by year, as control slipped away and dependency hardened into habit. The lights of the future had been switched on early, and just as early, the wiring had been placed in someone else's hands. The rest of this story is what happens when a nation finally decides to reach for the switch. Chapter 2. Fueling the world, starving at home. When the world went to war, Venezuela's oil went with it. In the early 1940s, as Europe burned and the Atlantic became a hunting ground for German submarines, crude oil turned into a weapon as decisive as tanks or aircraft. And Venezuela, far from the battlefields, became indispensable. Its oil flowed steadily from the Maracaibo Basin, safely beyond the reach of U-boats, feeding an Allied war effort desperate for fuel. By 1942, the scale was staggering. Roughly 80% of Britain's imported oil came from Venezuela. Tankers crossed the Caribbean and the Atlantic in constant motion, carrying the lifeblood of modern warfare. The engines of Allied bombers, the convoys rolling through North Africa, and later the armored divisions pushing into Nazi-occupied Europe, all ran, in part, on Venezuelan crude. When tanks finally entered Berlin in 1945, their steel tracks were driven by fuel extracted thousands of miles away, from land owned by a nation that remained largely invisible in victory photographs. Venezuela had helped power the triumph of the 20th century's defining war. Yet the triumph did not belong to it. At home, the reality was far quieter and far harsher. Oil wealth surged through ports and pipelines, but it passed above the heads of most Venezuelans like a river on stilts. Foreign companies expanded refineries and export terminals, but rural villages still lacked electricity, clean water, and basic healthcare. Caracas modernized in fragments, while vast regions remained untouched by the prosperity supposedly flowing beneath them. The contradiction deepened. Venezuela was indispensable to the world, but expendable to itself. Wartime demand locked the country even more tightly into its role as a supplier, not a decision-maker. Production increased, profits soared, and dependency hardened. The state collected royalties, but never control. Political leaders learned that stability mattered more than reform, that pleasing foreign partners mattered more than redistributing wealth at home. For ordinary people, the war years brought little change. There were no victory parades in the oil fields, no post-war boom in the barrios. The nation watched from the margins as its resources reshaped the world, while daily life remained marked by inequality and neglect. This was the cruel arithmetic of oil. The more valuable it became abroad,
the less agency Venezuela seemed to have at home. By the time the war ended, the global order had been remade, and Venezuela had secured its place within it, not as a power, not as a partner, but as a pillar beneath the structure, essential, unseen, and taken for granted. The engines of history had been fueled. The hunger, however, remained.
Chapter 3. Democracy Interrupted. For a brief moment, Venezuela dared to imagine a different future. In the mid-1940s, as the echoes of World War faded, a quiet hope took shape in Caracas. It carried the name Rómulo Betancourt, a civilian leader, a reformer, and a man who believed that Venezuela's wealth could one day belong to its people. Under his influence, the country experienced its first genuine steps toward modern democracy. Elections were held, political parties emerged from the shadows. For the first time, ordinary Venezuelans sensed that the state might answer to them rather than to foreign boardrooms and military barracks. Betancourt spoke openly about sovereignty. He questioned the terms under which foreign oil companies operated. He envisioned a Venezuela that could negotiate, regulate, and eventually control its own resources. It was a modest ambition by later standards, but at the time, it was revolutionary. The hope did not last. In 1948, less than a year after Venezuela's first truly free presidential election, the military intervened. Tanks rolled into the capital. Civilian rule collapsed. The elected government was removed without ceremony, and democracy was quietly shelved. The interruption was swift, decisive, and revealing. What followed was not chaos, but order of a different kind. A military strongman, Marcos Pérez Jiménez, rose to power and ruled with an iron hand. His regime promised stability, modernization, and growth, and for foreign interests it delivered exactly that. Oil flowed without interruption, contracts remained untouched, profits traveled safely abroad. Washington approved. In the language of the Cold War, Pérez Jiménez was described as a reliable anti-communist ally. His tolerance for foreign oil companies, his hostility to leftist movements, and his willingness to suppress dissent made him useful. Diplomatic support flowed freely. In 1954, U.S. President Dwight Eisenhower awarded him the Legion of Merit, even as censorship, torture, and political assassinations became routine at home. The message was unmistakable. Democracy was optional. Stability, especially stability favorable to oil, was not. For Venezuelans, the lesson cut deep. Each time the nation approached control over its own destiny, it was pulled back, firmly, sometimes violently, into a familiar role. Political participation was allowed only so long as it did not threaten the underlying structure of extraction and dependency. Democracy, it seemed, could exist, but only on a short leash. By the end of the 1950s, the dream had faded once more. Venezuela had roads, monuments, and oil revenues, but it did not have sovereignty. The interruption had hardened into a pattern, one that taught future leaders a dangerous truth. To challenge the ownership of oil was to challenge power itself. And power, when challenged, rarely remained patient for long. Chapter 4. The Pact that Locked the Future. When dictatorship finally fell in 1958, Venezuela exhaled. The collapse of Marcos Pérez Jiménez opened the door once more to civilian rule, and with it came a promise carefully designed to prevent the past from repeating itself. Political leaders gathered in a modest house in Caracas and signed what became known as the Punto Fijo Pact, an agreement meant to safeguard democracy through power sharing, compromise, and stability. On paper, it was a triumph. The pact ensured that the country's major political parties would respect election results, alternate power peacefully,
and exclude the military from politics. After decades of coups and strongmen, Venezuela appeared to have found a democratic formula that worked. For a time, it did. But stability came with conditions. The punto fijo system deliberately narrowed the political spectrum. Leftist movements, especially those questioning private control over oil and alignment with Washington, were pushed outside the circle of legitimacy. Democracy was allowed to function, but only within carefully drawn boundaries. Elections became predictable. Power rotated among elites who agreed, above all else, not to disturb the economic foundations of the state. Beneath the surface, Venezuela was being quietly integrated into a broader global order. As the Cold War deepened, economic policy followed a familiar script. International lenders, particularly the International Monetary Fund, promoted fiscal discipline, privatization, and market liberalization. What later came to be known as the Washington Consensus took hold gradually, shaping decisions about debt, spending, and development. Oil revenues softened the impact. For a while, the state expanded services without restructuring ownership. Consumption increased without diversification. Venezuela appeared prosperous, modern, and democratic, even as its dependence on a single resource deepened and inequality hardened. Those who resisted were met with force. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, left-wing activists, union leaders, and guerrilla movements faced surveillance, imprisonment, and in many cases, disappearance. This dirty war unfolded largely out of sight, overshadowed by the image of Venezuela as a stable, democratic exception in Latin America. But stability, once again, proved selective. The Pact had achieved its immediate goal, preventing coups, but it had also locked the future in place. Political change slowed. Economic imagination narrowed. Oil wealth became a cushion that delayed reform rather than a tool to enable it. By the late 20th century, the system showed signs of exhaustion. The parties remained, the elections continued, but faith began to erode. The state no longer felt responsive. Democracy had survived, but in a thinner, quieter form. The Punto Fijo Pact had delivered peace, but at a cost. It had traded participation for predictability and sovereignty for reassurance.
And in doing so, it taught a generation of Venezuelans a subtle, unsettling lesson. That democracy could exist, yet still feel out of reach. The future had been secured. It had also been sealed. Chapter 5. The day the streets exploded. On the morning of February 27, 1989, the streets of Venezuela broke their silence. It began quietly, almost trivially, with the price of a bus ticket. Overnight, fares rose sharply as part of an economic adjustment package announced by President Carlos Andrés Pérez, newly returned to power and determined to restore international confidence. The measures followed the familiar logic of the International Monetary Fund: cut subsidies, liberalize prices, discipline the economy. On paper, it was necessary. On the streets, it was unbearable. In the working-class town of Guarenas, commuters refused to pay the new fare. Arguments flared, drivers shut their doors. Within hours, frustration spilled outward, flowing toward Caracazo like a tide that had been held back for decades. By midday, crowds surged through the capital, breaking shop windows, seizing food, and overturning the symbols of an economy that no longer made sense to them. This was not a riot. It was an eruption. For years, Venezuelans had been told they lived in a stable democracy, protected by oil wealth and modern institutions. But beneath that image lay shrinking wages, rising debt, and a growing sense that the system served everyone,
except those who depended on it most. The bus fare was not the cause. It was the spark. The government responded with force. A state of emergency was declared. The military was deployed into densely populated neighborhoods. Soldiers fired into crowds. Curfews were imposed. Official broadcasts spoke of restoring order, but the streets told a different story. Gunfire echoed through the night. Bodies were left uncollected. Fear settled into the city like smoke. When the violence subsided days later, the true cost remained unclear. The government acknowledged a few hundred deaths. Human rights groups estimated thousands. Many victims were buried hastily, anonymously, in mass graves, including one that would later become known as La Peste, a quiet patch of land holding stories never officially told. The Caracazo shattered something fundamental. It broke the illusion that Venezuela's political system could absorb hardship without consequence. It revealed the fragility beneath decades of managed democracy and oil-funded stability. For many, it was the moment trust evaporated entirely, not only in a government, but in the idea that peaceful change was possible. In the aftermath, the streets grew quiet again. Shops reopened, buses resumed their routes. But the silence was different now. Heavier, charged. People remembered who had ordered the soldiers forward. They remembered how quickly the state had turned its weapons inward. And they remembered how invisible their suffering had been, until it exploded into view. The Caracazo was not just a protest. It was a verdict. A judgment delivered by the poor against a system that had promised inclusion and delivered exclusion instead.
From that day forward, Venezuelan society was divided not simply by class or party, but by belief. Belief in the system had died in the streets. Something else, angrier, louder, and far less patient, had been born in its place. Chapter 6. A paratrooper says, "For now." In the early hours of February 4th, 1992, a group of young military officers moved through the darkness of Caracas. They were paratroopers, trained for precision, discipline, and silence. At their center was a lieutenant colonel with a calm voice and an unmistakable presence. Hugo Chávez Frias. For years, he and his comrades had watched the country unravel from within its barracks and classrooms. The massacre of 1989 had left a mark that did not fade. The system, they believed, was no longer broken. It was hostile. Before dawn, tanks rolled. Soldiers attempted to seize key military bases and the presidential palace, Miraflores. The plan was bold, imperfect, and ultimately unsuccessful. Loyalist forces resisted. Communications failed. By morning, the uprising had collapsed. By any conventional measure, it was a failed coup. But history does not always turn on success. Chávez was captured and brought before national television. The authorities intended the broadcast as a warning to show the consequences of rebellion. Instead, it became a moment of transformation. Dressed in uniform, composed and unafraid, Chávez addressed the nation directly. He accepted responsibility, and then he said the words that would echo across Venezuela for decades. Por ahora. For now. It was a phrase barely longer than a breath, but heavy with implication. The goals, he said, had not been achieved. For now. The struggle, he implied, was unfinished. In less than a minute, Chávez had done what years of speeches and manifestos had failed to do. He gave voice to the anger left behind by the Caracazo. Across the country, people listened. In the barrios, families gathered around flickering televisions. In prisons, barracks, and university dormitories, the same image replayed. Here was a soldier who did not hide, who spoke plainly, who did not apologize for defying a system many had already judged illegitimate. Chávez was sent to prison, but the idea he embodied was released. From his cell, he became a symbol of defiance, of dignity, of possibility. The political class dismissed him as a reckless conspirator. The media struggled to categorize him, but among the poor and disillusioned, his name began to circulate quietly, then insistently. He was not yet a leader. He was a promise. The coup of 1992 did not overthrow the government. What it overthrew was the silence. It cracked the surface of Venezuelan politics and revealed the depth of frustration beneath. The system that had survived protests, repression, and reform now faced something new. A figure who spoke its language, wore its uniform, and rejected its legitimacy. When Chávez was released from prison 2 years later, the country he stepped back into was no longer the same. Neither was he. The paratrooper had failed to seize power by force, but with 3 words spoken calmly into a camera, he had seized something far more enduring. The future. For now. Chapter 7. Rewriting the Rules. In December 1998, Venezuela voted not just for a president, but for a rupture. After decades of rotating elites, broken promises, and managed democracy, the electorate turned to a man who had once tried to overthrow the system by force, and now sought to dismantle it by law. Hugo Chávez won the presidency with a commanding mandate, carried into office by voters who no longer believed the old rules could deliver change. From the beginning, Chávez made his intentions clear. He did not want to govern within the existing framework. He wanted to replace it. Within months, a referendum was held to convene a constituent assembly. The vote passed overwhelmingly. In 1999, a new constitution was drafted and approved, refounding the republic in both name and structure. It expanded social rights, strengthened executive authority, and, most importantly, reasserted state ownership over natural resources. Oil, once again, was placed at the center. The Constitution declared hydrocarbons the inalienable property of the Venezuelan people. Contracts were rewritten. Royalties increased. The national oil company, PDVSA, long operated as a state within the state, was brought firmly under political control. Decisions once made quietly by technocrats and foreign partners were now debated openly and, often loudly, by an elected government. To Chávez, this was sovereignty. To his critics, it was heresy. The balance that had governed Venezuela for decades, between foreign capital, domestic elites, and political stability, was suddenly gone. Chávez did not negotiate the edges of the system. As one observer famously put it, he took the board off the table. The game itself was being rewritten. Oil revenues were redirected toward ambitious social programs. Clinics appeared in poor neighborhoods. Education expanded. Subsidized food reached communities long ignored by the state. For millions, these changes were tangible, immediate, and deeply personal. But the costs were just as real.
foreign investors recoiled. Political polarization intensified. Institutions designed for compromise struggled under the weight of permanent confrontation. The state grew stronger, but more centralized. Power accumulated quickly and unevenly. Still, for Chávez and his supporters, the logic was simple. Venezuela had spent a century exporting wealth and importing inequality. Rewriting the rules was not optional. It was overdue. Internationally, the shift was unmistakable. Venezuela moved away from automatic alignment with Washington and toward a more confrontational, multipolar stance. Oil was no longer merely a commodity. It was a political instrument. By the turn of the millennium, the country stood at a crossroads. One path led toward deeper sovereignty and redistribution. The other warned of isolation, instability, and backlash. Chávez had chosen his direction. The old rules no longer applied. And for the first time in generations, Venezuela was not just playing the game of global power. It was daring to change how the game was played. Chapter 8. The coup that lasted 47 hours. On April 11th, 2002, the air in Caracas felt charged, as if the city itself sensed what was coming. For months, tensions had been rising. Business leaders, opposition parties, segments of the military, and much of the private media had turned openly against President Hugo Chávez. A strike at the national oil company, PDVSA, had crippled production. Television screens filled daily with warnings of chaos, dictatorship, and impending collapse. That morning, a massive opposition march moved through the capital. Originally planned to remain far from the presidential palace, the route was suddenly changed, redirected toward Miraflores, where Chávez's supporters were already gathered. By early afternoon, gunfire echoed through the streets. Confusion spread faster than facts. Television channels looped images of violence without context, narrating a single conclusion: Chávez had lost control. By nightfall, senior military officers appeared on screen to announce that the president had resigned. He had not. Chávez was arrested and taken to a remote military base. Power shifted swiftly. Business leader Pedro Carmona was sworn in as interim president, surrounded by political elites and foreign ambassadors. Within hours, he signed what became known as the Carmona Decree. It dissolved the National Assembly, dismissed the Supreme Court, suspended the Constitution of 1999. In one stroke, the institutional framework Venezuelans had approved by referendum vanished. Much of the Western press responded with relief. Headlines spoke of a restoration of democracy. Commentators framed the coup as a popular uprising against authoritarianism. Few mentioned the decree. Fewer still questioned how democracy could be restored by abolishing it entirely. But beyond television studios and diplomatic halls, another Venezuela was waking up. In the barrios surrounding Caracas, word spread quickly, not through broadcasts which had gone silent on the subject, but by phone calls, radios, and neighbors' voices. Chávez had not resigned. A government had been imposed. The constitution had been torn apart. And so, without leaders or cameras, the poor began to move. They came down from the hills in streams, men, women, elderly, children, walking toward the city center through the night. There were no banners, no speeches, only a shared certainty that something precious had been stolen. By dawn, Miraflores was surrounded, not by soldiers, but by citizens. Inside the military, the mood shifted. Officers who had supported the coup recoiled from the scale of public rejection. Others refused to recognize Carmona's authority. communications resumed. The narrative fractured. 47 hours after Chávez had been removed, the palace doors opened again. Hugo Chávez returned in the early hours of April 13th, weary but defiant. The constitution was reinstated. The coup collapsed as abruptly as it had begun.
Those who had celebrated its success now searched for explanations. For many Venezuelans, the lesson was unforgettable. Power could be taken swiftly, but legitimacy could not. Media could shape perception, but not erase reality on the ground. And the poor, long treated as spectators of history, had proven they were capable of rewriting its course. The coup had failed, but the line had been crossed. From that moment on, Venezuelan politics would no longer revolve around elections alone. It would be shaped by confrontation, loyalty, and the memory of how close the system had come to breaking entirely. The 47 hours passed quietly into history. Their echo did not. Chapter 9: Manufacturing an Opposition. After the failed coup of 2002, it became clear that removing Hugo Chávez by force carried risks that could no longer be denied. The strategy changed. No tanks, no decrees, no abrupt dissolutions of power. What followed instead was quieter, slower, and far more patient, a process not of overthrow, but of construction. An opposition would be built, trained, financed, and refined, until it could appear organic, democratic, and inevitable. At the center of this effort stood institutions that rarely appeared on ballots or in headlines. The United States Agency for International Development, USAID, and its Office of Transition Initiatives, OTI, expanded their presence in Venezuela in the years following the coup. Officially, their mission was benign: to strengthen civil society, support democratic participation, and encourage dialogue. In practice, their funding flowed selectively towards media outlets, non-governmental organizations, and political networks aligned against the Bolivarian project. A new generation was targeted. Student movements were cultivated as symbols of renewal and legitimacy. Workshops were organized, training materials circulated. Activists traveled abroad, attending seminars that emphasized non-violent resistance, media coordination, and strategic protest. Some of these programs traced their intellectual lineage to Belgrade, where the Serbian group Otpor had helped bring down Slobodan Milosevic years earlier. The methods were familiar: color-coded symbols, viral slogans, street theater, and carefully staged confrontations designed for cameras. In Venezuela, these techniques found faces. Leopoldo López, charismatic and American-educated, emerged as a prominent voice, articulate, confrontational, and unapologetically confrontational. Maria Corina Machado, outspoken and uncompromising, framed the struggle in moral absolutes. They did not speak the language of reform, but of rupture. Chávez, they argued, was not an adversary to be defeated at the polls, but an obstacle to be removed. The term color revolution was never officially adopted, but the pattern was recognizable. Protests were framed as spontaneous uprisings, even when coordination was meticulous. International media amplified narratives of heroic resistance and creeping dictatorship. Images traveled faster than context. Complex realities flattened into moral binaries. Inside Venezuela, the effect was polarizing. Supporters of the government saw a familiar script: foreign-backed destabilization dressed in democratic language. Critics saw courage, urgency, and a final chance to reclaim the country.
Between them, space for compromise evaporated. Elections continued, institutions remained, but trust dissolved. Opposition politics grew increasingly detached from electoral outcomes. Each defeat reinforced the belief that the system itself was illegitimate. Victory became not a process, but a destination, one that justified extraordinary measures. By the late 2000s, Venezuela no longer faced a unified opposition in waiting. It faced a permanent campaign of pressure, domestic and international, aimed at exhausting the government's legitimacy rather than defeating it at the ballot box. The battlefield had shifted from palaces to perceptions. What was being manufactured was not merely dissent, but inevitability. The sense that change was not only necessary, but overdue, unstoppable, and already in motion. And once that belief took hold, the country would discover how difficult it was to slow events that had been designed to accelerate. Chapter 10: Chaos as a Strategy. By the second decade of the 21st century, Venezuelan politics had entered a new phase, one defined less by persuasion than by pressure. Elections still took place, ballots were cast and counted, but for a growing segment of the opposition, electoral defeat no longer signaled an end. It signaled a beginning. The goal was no longer to win power through institutions, but to make governing impossible. The tactic had a name: guarimbas. On paper, guarimbas were protests. In practice, they were blockades, burning tires, barricaded streets, and neighborhoods sealed off with debris and wire. Middle-class districts became fortified islands. Mobility collapsed. Daily life fractured. What had once been sporadic unrest hardened into a deliberate method. Violence followed. Molotov cocktails arced through the night. Public buildings burned. Snipers appeared on rooftops. Civilians, caught between barricades and security forces, paid the price. Some died in clashes. Others were lynched on suspicion alone. Fear became ambient, woven into the ordinary rhythms of life. In 2014, the strategy was formalized under the slogan La Salida, the exit. Its message was explicit: the government must go immediately and by any means necessary. Dialogue was dismissed as delay. Elections were rejected as traps. Stability itself was framed as complicity. The architects of La Salida understood something fundamental. Chaos attracts attention. International media, conditioned to respond to spectacle, focused on flames and confrontations. Headlines spoke of uprising and repression, rarely pausing to ask why protests concentrated in specific neighborhoods, or why elected avenues were being deliberately abandoned. Images traveled faster than explanations. Perception hardened before facts could intervene. Inside Venezuela, the effect was corrosive. Supporters of the government felt besieged, convinced the unrest was engineered rather than organic. Critics felt justified, persuaded that disruption was the only remaining language of power. Between them, the social fabric tore quietly, thread by thread. Chaos became a political instrument. Every burned bus, every blocked road, every sleepless night added pressure, not only on the state, but on ordinary citizens desperate for normalcy. The hope was simple. Exhaustion would succeed where ballots had failed. But chaos is a dangerous ally. As violence escalated, it slipped beyond its architect's control. Protesters clashed with one another. Neighborhoods turned inward. Trust dissolved, even among those nominally on the same side. The economy, already strained, buckled further under uncertainty and disruption. What had begun as strategy risked becoming condition. By the time the streets quieted, little had been resolved. The government remained, the opposition fractured, and the population carried the cost, measured not only in lives lost, but in the normalization of instability.
The Guarimbas faded, but their legacy remained. They taught a lesson that would shape the years ahead. That in Venezuela, power could be contested not only through institutions or ideology, but through exhaustion itself. And once chaos becomes a tool, it rarely stays confined to those who believe they are wielding it. Chapter 11. The Siege Without Walls. In 2014, the ground beneath Venezuela shifted, silently, decisively. Global oil prices collapsed, falling from over $100 a barrel to less than half that value in a matter of months. For a country whose economy had been built almost entirely on petroleum exports, the impact was immediate and unforgiving. Revenue evaporated. Foreign currency reserves thinned. The margin for error vanished. At the same time, another pressure tightened. Financial sanctions, initially targeted, later expansive, began to encircle the Venezuelan state. Access to international credit was restricted. Assets were frozen. Transactions that had once been routine became legal and logistical obstacles. Banks hesitated. Suppliers withdrew. Even humanitarian imports became entangled in compliance fears. It was not a blockade in the traditional sense. No ships were turned away by force. No borders were sealed. Yet the effect resembled something far older. Former United Nations rapporteur Alfred de Zayas would later describe the situation as a medieval siege, a strategy not of invasion, but of exhaustion. The walls were invisible, but they held. The pressure was financial, but its consequences were human. Inside the country, shortages multiplied. Pharmacies emptied first. Life-saving medicines, insulin, antibiotics, chemotherapy drugs became difficult or impossible to obtain. Hospitals rationed supplies. Doctors improvised. Families searched endlessly, trading information in whispers and handwritten notes. Food followed. Imports slowed. Shelves thinned. Long lines formed outside state-run stores. Meals shrank. Malnutrition reappeared in a nation that had once exported abundance. The crisis was uneven, felt most acutely by the poor, the elderly, and the chronically ill, but its shadow reached everywhere. The government blamed sanctions and economic warfare. Its critics pointed to mismanagement, corruption, and dependency. Both narratives contained truths. Neither offered immediate relief. What mattered most was the lived experience. For ordinary Venezuelans, daily life became a careful calculation of calories, of kilometers walked in search of supplies, of favors owed and repaid. Time was no longer spent planning futures, but securing the present. Survival narrowed the horizon. Outside the country, the story was told in fragments. Economic collapse was framed as inevitability. Shortages were reduced to statistics. Sanctions were described as pressure on a regime, not on a population. The language remained clean, even as the consequences grew unbearable. This was the siege without walls. No armies marched, no declarations were made, but a nation found itself constrained, weakened, and slowly drained, caught between global markets it could not control and political battles it could not escape. By the end of the decade, Venezuela had been transformed. Not conquered, not invaded, but worn down day by day, until even the most basic assumptions of modern life felt fragile. And in that fragility, the stage was set for a new kind of crisis, one that would arrive not with soldiers or sanctions, but with silence and darkness. Chapter 12. A President Without a Country. On January 23, 2019, a relatively unknown opposition legislator stepped onto a makeshift stage in Caracazo and raised his right hand. His name was Juan Guaidó. Moments later, he declared himself interim president of Venezuela. There was no election, no transfer of power, no control over ministries, borders, or armed forces. Yet within minutes, the declaration echoed far beyond the plaza where it was spoken. Phones rang in foreign capitals, statements were drafted. A parallel reality began to take shape. Earlier that same day, according to multiple accounts later confirmed by US officials, Vice President Mike Pence had placed a call. The message was brief and unambiguous. The United States would recognize Guaidó as Venezuela's legitimate leader if he took the step. He did. Within hours, Washington offered formal recognition. Canada followed. Much of the European Union soon joined. Latin American governments aligned under the banner of the Lima Group. Diplomatic cables shifted language overnight. Assets belonging to the Venezuelan state were reassigned. Embassies received new instructions. A government had been recognized, but not a country governed. Inside Venezuela, nothing changed. Nicolás Maduro remained in the presidential palace. The military stayed loyal. Institutions continued to function, strained, imperfect, but intact. Guaidó commanded no territory, no budget, no police force. His authority existed almost entirely abroad. It was governance by declaration, a presidency without ministries, a state without sovereignty, a government made of statements, press conferences, and recognition lists. Supporters framed it as constitutional necessity, a lawful response to a fraudulent election. Critics called it unprecedented interference. But for ordinary Venezuelans, the distinction mattered little. Daily life continued under shortages, sanctions, and uncertainty. The presence of two presidents did not produce two sources of bread, medicine, or electricity. Still, the international apparatus moved swiftly. Venezuelan assets overseas were frozen or transferred. The country's US-based oil subsidiary, Citgo, was placed under Guaidó-aligned control. Diplomats loyal to Maduro were expelled. Sanctions intensified, now justified as pressure on an illegitimate regime. Yet the promised transition never arrived. Months passed, then years. Guaidó's support eroded at home as expectations collided with reality. Failed uprisings, aborted negotiations, and unfulfilled promises accumulated. What remained was a strange political artifact. A government that existed largely on paper, recognized in conference rooms, but absent from the streets it claimed to represent. In time, even foreign backers grew quieter. Recognition lingered, but enthusiasm faded. Juan Guaidó had become something rare in modern politics, a president acknowledged by the world, yet unable to govern a single neighborhood. A symbol of pressure without power, and a reminder that legitimacy, once detached from lived authority, can sustain itself only so long before the silence grows louder than the applause. Chapter 13. The Trojan Horse of Aid. In February 2019, the world's attention shifted to a narrow strip of land on Venezuela's western border, to the Colombian city of Cúcuta. There, beneath floodlights and television cameras, a convoy of trucks waited in formation. Their white sides were freshly painted. Their cargo was neatly boxed. The word repeated in every headline and every speech was the same: humanitarian aid. Food, medicine, relief. For weeks, the convoy had been framed as a lifeline, proof that help was ready if only the Venezuelan government would step aside. Concerts were staged nearby. Politicians posed for photographs. The moment was choreographed to appear inevitable, moral, and urgent. Inside Venezuela, the government refused entry. President Nicolás Maduro argued that the operation was not neutral assistance, but a political provocation designed to force a confrontation at the border and fracture military loyalty. Supporters of Juan Guaidó dismissed the claim, insisting that rejecting aid was itself a crime. On February 23rd, the confrontation came. Opposition supporters surged towards the border crossings. Venezuelan security forces blocked access. Tear gas drifted. Rocks flew. Shouts drowned out commands. Then, amid the confusion, a truck began to burn. The images were immediate and devastating. Flames climbing the white metal sides, boxes blackening in the heat, reporters speaking urgently into microphones. Within hours, a single narrative had settled across international media. The Venezuelan government had burned humanitarian aid meant for its own people. Condemnation followed at once. Yet later, when footage was examined frame by frame, the story fractured. Independent journalists and subsequent investigations showed that the fire was likely caused by Molotov cocktails thrown from the opposition side, not by government forces. The truck had not been deliberately torched on command. It had caught fire in the chaos of a staged confrontation. By then, the correction barely mattered. The aid itself, it emerged, had never been sufficient to address Venezuela's shortages. Its volume was symbolic, not systemic. Its power lay not in calories or medicine, but in imagery, in the moral pressure created by a spectacle designed for global consumption. The convoy had functioned less as relief than as theater. A Trojan horse, not because aid was unnecessary, Venezuela needed it desperately, but because the operation's primary aim was political, to provoke a rupture, to delegitimize refusal, to force a moment of collapse before cameras rolling live. Inside the country, trust eroded further. Government supporters pointed to manipulation and distortion. Critics saw only cruelty and denial. The space for shared truth narrowed almost to nothing. Outside Venezuela, the story moved on quickly. Headlines faded. Retractions, where they existed, arrived quietly. The image of burning aid lingered longer than the facts that followed it. The trucks never crossed the border. But something else had crossed a line. From that moment on, even the language of humanitarianism was no longer neutral. Aid had become part of the battlefield, and compassion itself had been folded into strategy. In the quiet after the flames died out, one truth remained unresolved. When help arrives carrying an agenda, who decides whether it is help at all? Chapter 14. Darkness at Noon. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon on March 7th, 2019, Venezuela went dark. The outage did not creep in gradually, nor did it respect geography or class. It arrived all at once. From the coastal cities to the Andean highlands, from the capital to the most remote villages, the lights vanished. Air conditioners stopped. Elevators froze. Subway trains stalled between stations. In hospitals, generators groaned under sudden, unbearable strain. The failure traced back to a single source, the Guri Dam. Rising from the Caroni River in southeastern Venezuela, Guri was not merely a power station. It supplied the majority of the nation's electricity. It was a symbol of modern engineering and national pride, an assumption built into daily life so deeply that few remembered its fragility. That evening, its systems collapsed. Officials announced a massive disturbance in the transmission network. Engineers spoke of cascading failures. For ordinary Venezuelans, the technical language mattered little. What they felt was silence, heat without relief, darkness settling in before nightfall. Food spoiled quickly. Water pumps stopped. Communications failed. For days, large parts of the country remained without power. In some areas, the blackout lasted weeks. The modern state receded, replaced by candles, buckets, and improvised routines. Outside Venezuela, reactions were swift and telling. Within hours, US Senator Marco Rubio tweeted that the blackout was no accident, warning that it would worsen humanitarian conditions and placing blame squarely on the government. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo followed, with messages framing the outage as the inevitable result of incompetence and corruption. The timing raised questions. Only weeks earlier, Venezuela had endured intense political pressure, escalating sanctions, and a failed attempt to force regime change through parallel governance. Now, the country's electrical backbone had collapsed in a way few had imagined possible. The government claimed sabotage. Officials spoke of cyber attacks, electromagnetic interference, and coordinated efforts to destabilize critical infrastructure. Skeptics dismissed the claims as deflection. Yet independent analysts acknowledged that modern power grids, especially those under strain, were vulnerable to remote disruption. No definitive proof emerged. What remained was ambiguity and its consequences. In the darkness, rumors spread faster than facts. Some blamed foreign powers. Others blamed neglect and mismanagement. Many blamed both. The blackout became a mirror, reflecting every fear and conviction already present in Venezuelan society. For the population, the experience was deeply physical. Sleep became difficult in suffocating heat. Streets emptied after sunset. Food scarcity worsened as refrigeration failed. Hospitals rationed care. The crisis was not dramatic in a cinematic sense. It was slow, exhausting, and intimate. This was darkness at noon. Not merely the absence of light, but the exposure of vulnerability. A nation already weakened by economic siege now confronted the collapse of its most basic infrastructure. Whether caused by sabotage, decay, or a convergence of pressures, the result was the same. Powerlessness, literal and political, settled in. When electricity gradually returned, it did not restore confidence. Instead, it left behind a quiet understanding that modern life, once taken for granted, could be switched off without warning, and that in Venezuela's long struggle, even the lights themselves had become part of the battlefield. The blackout did not decide the conflict, but it illuminated, in the starkest possible way, how close the country had come to the edge, and how easily it could be pushed again. Chapter 15. When the Palace Did Not Fall. Just before dawn on April 30th, 2019, a small group of soldiers appeared on a highway overpass in Caracazo. They wore blue armbands, a simple signal meant to announce allegiance and momentum. Standing beside them
was Juan Guaidó, flanked by opposition leader Leopoldo López, newly freed from house arrest. Behind them, a military base. Ahead of them, the presidential palace. The message was unmistakable. The end had arrived. A video was released, urgent and defiant. Guaidó called on the armed forces to rise, declaring the final phase of Operation Freedom. For supporters watching from abroad, it looked like the long-awaited rupture. Social media filled with speculation. Headlines spoke cautiously of a turning point. But the palace did not fall. Within hours, the reality became clear. The soldiers present numbered in the dozens, not the thousands. Key military commanders remained loyal to Nicolas Maduro. Bases across the country reported no movement. The uprising, intended to appear decisive, revealed itself as fragile. Confusion replaced confidence. Opposition leaders contradicted one another. Rumors of mass defections proved unfounded. Protesters who flooded into the streets found themselves facing familiar barriers and tear gas. By midday, the operation had unraveled. Leopoldo López sought refuge in a foreign embassy. Guaidó vanished from public view. The blue armbands disappeared as quickly as they had appeared. It was over. In Washington, patience thinned. For months, US officials had spoken with certainty about imminent change. Sanctions had been tightened, diplomatic recognition extended. Public statements hinted at military defections waiting just beneath the surface. April 30th exposed the limits of that confidence. Privately, frustration grew. Officials acknowledged that intelligence had been flawed, promises exaggerated, timelines misjudged. Publicly, the rhetoric remained firm, but the urgency softened. Options narrowed. The language of inevitability gave way to something quieter: endurance. Inside Venezuela, the failed uprising carried a different weight. For government supporters, it confirmed suspicions of foreign orchestration and opposition recklessness. For opposition supporters, it was devastating. Another promise had collapsed. Another final moment had passed without resolution. The cost was not measured in casualties, but in credibility. The strategy of shortcuts, of expecting power to collapse from pressure alone, had reached its limit. The palace still stood. The institutions, strained but intact, remained in place. The government had survived not because it was strong, but because its opponents were divided and overextended. April 30th marked the end of an illusion. The belief that change would arrive suddenly, cleanly, and from above, dissolved in the morning light. What remained was a slower, heavier reality, one that offered no clear exits and no dramatic conclusions. When the palace did not fall, the story did not end. It simply lost its final act. And in that unfinished silence, Venezuela settled once more into uncertainty, waiting, watching, and learning how long a country can remain suspended between collapse and survival. Epilogue: After the siege. When the noise finally fades, what remains is not an argument, but a mark. Venezuela's recent history resists simple verdicts. It cannot be reduced to heroes and villains, nor contained within slogans of success or failure. Instead, it lingers like a scar, visible, sensitive, shaped by forces both internal and external, by choices made and pressures applied. The siege did not arrive with armies at the gates. It came through markets, media, and money, through expectations raised and broken, through moments of hope, followed by long nights of waiting. And like all sieges, its deepest damage was not only material, but psychological. the slow erosion of certainty, trust, and time. Yet even scars tell stories of survival. Through blackouts and shortages, sanctions and standoffs, daily life continued. Children went to school when they could. Families adapted, shared, endured. History, after all, is not only written in palaces and press conferences, but in kitchens lit by candles and conversations spoken in lowered voices. This story does not end with victory or defeat. It pauses. Venezuela remains suspended between what it was, what it was promised, and what it has become. A living reminder that nations, like people, can be wounded without disappearing. That power can be contested without resolution. And that the consequences of history often unfold more slowly than the events that cause them. As this chapter closes, the lights are not fully restored, but they are no longer completely out. If this quiet journey through history helped you understand the night behind the headlines, consider staying with us. Subscribe to the channel, share your reflections, and let us know which story you would like to fall asleep to next. For now, rest. History will still be here when you wake.